Hi, Misha here, and a couple of people have asked about doing a newer video on the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk, or as it's exactly known, the F-117A, and often nicknamed the Stealth Fighter. And there's a new model out from Hobby Master here from the Flying Knights, or the Dark Knights. And I have it in its ground configuration. And here's my older one, which is probably dusty. Not a lot of variation in these because there was only one production model. Just different ordnance load. You have a few different guided bombs. One of the more modern ones they would use would be J dams, also paveways and whatnot. So it just seemed like a great time to redo this. So yeah, let's get into the story. This was one of the blackest of black projects. And even though it was really the first U.S. fighter type aircraft to be built with so-called stealth technology, and then we've had many generations since, somehow this still has a certain allure and mystery to it that maybe later aircraft like the F-35 or even F-22 just didn't quite achieve. This had something that a lot of other aircraft just did not. Plus, it really does look like a UFO. And it really did come from Area 51, so maybe it was. Going all the way back to the 1960s, mathematical theory kind of speculated about what it would take to produce an aircraft with low radar return, basically radar invisibility, stealth. There was speculation, there was thought, but nothing happened. Meanwhile, the U.S. lost a number of aircraft during the Vietnam War to surface-to-air missiles, mostly ground fire, but also to other fighters. But yeah, mostly SAMs and artillery that are radar directed. And in the 1970s, specifically in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli Air Force lost a number of aircraft, mostly F-4 Phantoms. And this all just highlighted the need for having an aircraft that could avoid encountering SAM and AA fire. In 1974, the government did a study kind of projecting if war to ever break out with the Warsaw Pact, what would happen to Allied fighters and bombers if they tried going through Central Europe and into Eastern Europe, and let's just say the results were not encouraging. Thus, we get to the hopeless diamond. Luckily, computer technology had progressed a good ways over the previous decade, and so talks began with how they could design a stealth aircraft. And this would kind of end up in the lap of Kelly Johnson and Ben Rich at Lockheed's Skunk Works. And it would progress to the point where we had a contract for 2 test aircraft, which would ultimately be Project Have Blue. And the first of these would fly on December 1st of 1977. These 2 test aircraft came in under budget and actually even a little early. And they really accomplished this by just using off-the-shelf components as much as they could. They used aspects, they used parts from the F-16, even the A-10 Warthog, and even the T-38 training aircraft. But it was just a concept to prove it worked. And it did, because in November of 1978, a development contract was awarded to Lockheed to create this aircraft here. Now, interestingly, there was a bit of a disagreement between Kelly Johnson and Ben Rich over what to do. If you look at this aircraft, you'll notice it's all flat panels, including like the cockpit. It's all at angles. These panelings, this system was known as facets, or faceting, or the fact that my model likes to tip up when it's not on its stand. Now, Kelly Johnson wanted to go more rounded edges. He thought this would give low radar return and be easier to fly. The funny thing is, he was wrong in the 1970s, but actually, later time would kind of prove him right. But for the time, using the computer tech that they had, using a program named Echo, Ben Rich developed this style here, and then developed an advanced computer fly-by-wire system to control the aircraft, which was grossly unstable and needing constant corrections that no pilot could ever do. And for the technology and manufacturing ability of that day and time, Rich's ideas worked. So that's what this was based on. So they would start working up. They would begin building the first pre-production models, known as the F-117. And the first of these would fly on June 18, 1981. It should be pointed out that both of the Have Blue prototypes were lost to crashes throughout their testing phase. But again, these were just concept models anyway. But it just goes to show you how unstable the aircraft was and how much it really did rely on its computer systems to, maintain things. So after the first successful test flight of a pre-production model, they would begin work on the first true production aircraft, known as the F-117A. And the name is actually quite interesting. This is not a fighter, even though it's marked with an F. It's more of an A series, attack series bomber aircraft, so it should have been an A or a B. But they made it an F series more for propaganda reasons. And the 117 number is also interesting. It would make it seem like it was part of the Century series, but it really was almost a random number assigned to the test aircraft as a radio call sign during the late 70s, early 80s. So the 117 name was just kind of stumbled upon. I mean, you can say, well, they had various MiGs and Sukhois that they gave names like the F-112, F-113. But it was just given an arbitrary, temporary name that kind of stuck. So that's why the name is just kind of way out of left field for what we have here. But at any rate, by 1983, production models were rolling off the assembly line. They would ultimately build 5 YF-117 pre-production test models, and by October of 1983, the first F-117As were starting to enter into initial operational readiness. Yeah, the F-117 sure changed a lot from pre-production to production, right? The LTV A7 Corsair was actually started up in 1981 to begin training a squadron for the Nighthawk because it was felt to be the most similar in terms of performance and what have you. So they would use these for training even before the first Nighthawks were ready. They would also use these as chase planes. And to some extent, these would be kind of cover for what the pilots were doing at Groom Lake, Area 51. They would also use F-5 Tigers as cover. Because again, this is an ultra top secret program. So they start to reach initial operational readiness towards the end of 1983. And throughout the 1980s, they would be training up. There would be a couple of crashes with the pre-production models, one in 86, one in 87. These would also be covered up. They would actually use wreckage from an F-101 Voodoo to cover one up. So this is all cloak and dagger stuff, true cover-ups. So what's it all for? What is the Nighthawk? Well, this is a attack aircraft, or even a bomber. Now it is, or at least by the standards of the 1980s, stealth. It would give a very small radar return. They also did what they could to minimize the infrared and the heat signature from the engines. This has 2 General Electric engines, but it was subsonic. It was only capable of reaching Mach 0.9, and really it cruised at about 600 miles per hour or less. So subsonic. They didn't go supersonic because it would make an even larger exhaust. Also, the sonic boom would be kind of counterproductive for its role. On the other hand, it was capable of aerial refueling, so it could make long trips, 12, 15, even 18-hour trips with the refueling. It had a pretty spacious cockpit with pretty advanced controls for the time. The only negative, because of the shape, the pilot's view was a little curtailed, especially towards the rear. Of course, it had standard ejection seats and all that good stuff. It did not have a radar system as such. It did not have a laser for designating. So in some ways, it was pretty straightforward. It was very much a single-purpose aircraft. It was designed for stealth, and that's exactly what it did. It had no guns. It had exactly 2 weapons. Coming back to this one here, it had really 1 internal bay under here with 2 sections, and each section had 1 hard point, 1 attachment point for 1 air-to-surface missile or bomb. Like here, we have laser-guided paveways. It could also carry 2 penetrators, and later on in its service, it could carry 2 GPS-guided JDAMs. Total capacity internal was 5,000 pounds. No external hardpoints. Remember, the idea behind this was to fly into enemy airspace and deliver a precision strike, and that's what it was good at. It did have the ability to very precisely target with only 2 bombs it had to do. Overall, this is not a small plane. It's about 66 feet by 43 feet. It's about the size overall of an F-15, but a much, much smaller radar return. It has a stealth coating, although it was pretty hard to maintain, required routine maintenance, and required being kept in climate-controlled, air-conditioned hangars and whatnot. Maximum altitude was about 40 to 45,000 feet, depending on the condition. So again, we're not flying high, we're flying relatively low and relying on the stealth here. So this remained extremely classified until November 10, 1988, at which time the Deputy Secretary of Defense revealed one picture of the aircraft. Many had speculated its name was F-19. Eventually, they would confirm the name as the F-117A Nighthawk. And then by 1990, they started flying these during the day, letting the public really see them. And so the kind of classified nature would start to fall back a bit, although much of the construction and technology was still classified. And then in July of that year, 1990, the final production aircraft was delivered, bringing the total to 59 production, 5 pre-production, for a total of 64. And by this time, a couple have already been lost to crashes. But now it is at least fully acknowledged, and we're towards the end of the Cold War. But keep in mind, by 1990, this is already decade-old technology. And again, computer technology has progressed along quite a ways. But, this was still quite a successful project and really did push technology forward. Both models here are 1/72 scale die-cast metal from Hobby Master. As you can see, you can do gear up or down. You can do weapons bay open or closed. You do get a choice in weaponry, at least for some of these. You can do canopy open or closed. Pilot figure in and out. And it does come with a stand. Actually, it's one of their better ones because the stem is made of metal. My only gripe is, and I don't know why they did it this way, you can't really put it on the stand and display it with the weapons bay open. But otherwise, nice model. It's quite big and heavy. The fuselage and wing is all metal. The tail stabilizers are plastic because they're so thin. And of course, things like the weapons door, plastic. The landing gear is actually metal with rubber wheels, though, so that's kind of neat. The wheels don't roll, but... And Hobby Master does kind of a one-piece insert. The front gear is one piece, the rear is actually one here, and then the upper one here. So 2 for that. And the weapons bay, when it's open, the centerpiece is here, and you have your missiles, bombs. Very nicely done models. And about the right size, too. Big enough for detail, but small enough you don't need an entire shelf for one. A short time after the aircraft's existence was at least acknowledged, in 1989, 2 F-117s were used to hit an airfield in Panama, a relatively successful operation. And then in 1991, January, Operation Desert Storm, the Gulf War. That's when this aircraft made its big debut, when people really got to know it, myself included. And it was praised during the conflict. It helped open a hole in the Iraqis' air defense. These were used to hit high-value targets with precision, and they were used over downtown Baghdad. At that time, they were given an 80% success rate, of hitting their targets. Post facto, this was kind of downgraded to 60% or even 40%, keeping in mind the technology of that day. But none were lost during the Desert Storm campaign. So in 1992, this was basically declassified, and attempts were made to integrate the Nighthawk into the standard Air Force fleet. But it took a long time. They were kind of seen as something separate, something apart. In fact, the pilots of these would call themselves bandits, and it was a bit of a elite community. 558 Air Force personnel, plus a few RAF guests, were trained and flew this aircraft. So it was still something apart and separate, and to some extent elite. And its reputation would continue throughout the 1990s, but on March 27 of 1999, the first and only Nighthawk was shot down over Serbia after kind of the way they took advantage of the Iraqi defense network. Some AA installations in Serbia with competent commanders upgraded with newer technology. Sorry about that. And when the aircraft has its bays open, and a few other times it's less stealthy, more open and visible. And so one battery was able to target and successfully launch a SAM that exploded near enough by an F-117 that it disrupted the control systems, did damage. Luckily, the pilot ejected safely and was recovered, and the airframe crashed pretty much fully intact, and the Serbians recovered it. This was offered to to Russia for study. Now, the U.S. had considered going in with a bombing strike to just destroy the wreckage, but it was decided that, this technology now was 20 years old, first-generation stealth. It wasn't worth it. So, yeah, Russia got a peek. It wasn't probably stuff they didn't already know. Well, time moves on. These are still very much in service. Another one was damaged during flight on April 30 of 1999. It did make it back to its base, but it's said that afterwards it was damaged severely enough that the airframe was just written off. So 2 were lost during the former Yugoslavia campaigns. But moving into Afghanistan in 2001, the Nighthawk was again used, and it was deployed during the Second Iraq War in 2003, yet again hitting high-value targets. It had received some updates, again, things like able to use near munitions, GPS-guided, what have you. Still was known for precision targeting, but it was difficult to maintain its stealth coding. It did not have the latest features. It was still subsonic. It had a limited payload. So really, moving into 2004 and 2005, these were only used when they really needed to go in and hit a target with precision, or they needed to have a flyover to confirm a target was taken out by another aircraft. So pretty specific roles. And so these started to be used in pretty limited, very special purpose situations, because again, newer stealth technology had surpassed it. And as I said at the beginning, Kelly Johnson had the idea to go rounded surfaces, which was the wrong idea for 1975, but actually, by 2005, it was kind of the right idea. In 2005, the F-22A Raptor started to go into service, so its technology was 2 decades more advanced than the Nighthawks, and if you notice, it is much rounder on the surfaces, more conventional canopy. Still has enclosed weapons bays, but it does have 4 hard points under the wings for tanks or missiles. It also has vectored thrust engines. It's supersonic, and it was designed as a true fighter. It even has a cannon, radar, all kinds of more modern equipment. So this really was kind of showing that stealth did not have to be with facets and goofy right angles. That a relatively conventional looking aircraft could have stealth if properly modeled with, well, still would have been 20th century, but, very advanced computers. Now, originally, the Air Force planned to keep the Nighthawk in full service until 2011. But in December of 2005, the Air Force proposed early retirement by 2008 of the F-117 to free up some budget to purchase things like new F-22s. And in 2006, the training facility was closed for this aircraft, so no new pilots would be trained for it. And then, beginning in March of 2007, the first 6 F-117s were retired. And they would retire these in waves. There were 7 waves. And the last one would get ready to go in April of 2008. A few were left flying for that summer, and then they too were retired in August of 2008. Now, they didn't just send these to the boneyard. They didn't scrap them. Quite to the contrary. By order of Congress, they were very carefully mothballed, preserved. They had their wings removed. And they were put in climate-controlled hangars and maintained. In fact, some of them were maintained in flying condition just to make sure they could. And that's kind of what happened. Most of them were stored. A few were taken out and flown, now and again, maintaining the fleet. But by 2016, now the Air Force and Congress, they're all ready to start scrapping the F-117. It's been another decade. The technology is that much older. The F-35 is now coming into service. Keep in mind, this was a precision bomber, essentially, whereas the F-22 was a fighter, although it did have limited ground, or does have limited ground attack ability. But the F-35 actually is a true multi-role fighter with ground attack. So, the first 4 were taken out of storage and fully demilitarized, sent to the boneyard in 2017. And the idea was to slowly take them out and scrap them. And that's kind of where we were at until 2019. Now, ostensibly, the Nighthawk had been retired in 2008. But in 2019, a few people spotted, even photographed some of these flying. And then a rumor came out that back in 2016, 4 of these had been sent for a clandestine operation or operations in the Middle East. And things only became more interesting last year in 2020. Beginning in February, more F-117s were spotted flying. And then kind of closing out the year in October, there were photographs taken of these being out doing things. Some were even photographed in Death Valley, which is a thing. So it's kind of interesting. Why are these still flying? What's going on? It almost seems like they were, quote-unquote, retired them to get them out of the public's eye. You have to wonder, though, it has a limited payload, only 5,000 pounds. It can only carry 2 bombs. It's subsonic. It's expensive to operate. It's 1970s tech. You would think with the F-35 and the F-22, not to mention the B-2 bomber, what's the purpose of this? Why maintain even a handful of these in flying condition and fly them? What advantage does it give? I think there's a certain reverence for this because of how interesting it is. I mean, the angles and everything, it has a certain look that even today is kind of space agey. The F-22 is a much more advanced plane, but it's also more conventional. And the F-35, in a lot of ways, reminds me of the F-16. But nothing quite looks like the Nighthawk, the stealth fighter. And it really earned itself a reputation in the Air Force and then with the public that it really hasn't been shaken even to this day. So it's interesting where this aircraft's future is. Is it truly retired? Is it truly over? And again, personally, I just have to wonder why they're still trying to maintain and fly a 40-year-old design. Quite interesting. And I also think it's interesting that Kelly Johnson was kind of right in the 70s. It's just he was way too early. Computer tech back then absolutely could not calculate how to make a conventional style aircraft stealthy. They really did have to resort to this crazy design that had quadruple redundancy to make sure the fly-by-wire didn't fail, because if it did, it was less aerodynamic than a brick. It's just an interesting plane, though. And I thought it was high time that kind of covered the aircraft again here from Lockheed. So what do you think? Again, there's only the one version for the Air Force. They did try to make one for the Navy, try to entice the Navy, but there was no interest. They did test it out, or at least conceptually, for carrier use, but not surprisingly, they found that it was not well suited. Similarly, they tried to make a naval version for operating offshore bases. It didn't go anywhere. And they actually did offer the RAF, the English, a shot at this, and they evaluated it and really didn't find it to their needs. So, there you have it, folks. So let me know what you think. And as always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.